workforce.
Yeah.
If you
And
look at the industries that strike and complain, it tends to be female-dominated industries because women are better at complaining.
no,
They
because
want to do less of the work and they want more of the credit.
we care about how we're treated, as men should care how they're treated. And they do care, they just internalize it. Just because they don't take action doesn't mean that they don't care.
What is your definition of feminism?
So, my definition of feminism is probably the broad overarching definition, which would be wanting equal opportunity and representation for women and, feminine presenting people. I think that we should be equally represented in political and other kinds of positions of power. I think that we should be advocated for in our unique life circumstances and the things that make us, uniquely feminine. And I think that we need to ensure that women have all the opportunity that men are afforded.
Okay. So is your view today that we're not being given the opportunity, that we are? Like what is your view on feminism historically, and like where is it needed today?
Yeah, so I think where this conversation, especially in sort of like conservative spheres,
Yeah.
gets confusing is that you tend to focus more on like legal barriers, that there's
Okay.
no laws that are preventing women from obtaining certain opportunities, applying for certain jobs, going to schools, things like that. Where the more nuanced and modern view is there are no longer any legal barriers, but there are still plenty of societal barriers. There's a lot of discrimination, things like not having like maternity leave, the caregiving gap, things like that, that disproportionately inhibit women from being able to go after certain opportunities because of the responsibilities that heavily, rely on us
Mhm.
instead of having a lot of that labor and unpaid domestic labor
Mhm.
seen, respected, and divided.
Okay. So how does that translate in 2024? Like how would that have affected me, for example?
Well, I can't speak to you and your life
Well,
experience,
yeah,
but
but
I can
some
speak to
yeah,
mine.
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So, as a woman in medicine, that is a very long journey. I got my bachelor's degree, my master's degree,
Mhm.
my doctorate, and now I have I'm
Well,
in,
yeah, but just like a guy,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
well, but I'll explain to
Okay, yeah,
you
go ahead,
how it has
sorry.
affected me. So, and I'm currently in residency, which is my postdoctoral training. And so, a lot of this I've needed to dedicate
Mhm.
80 plus hours a week to studying, to working in order to be able to have my dream job.
Mhm.
And so something like starting a family has needed to be delayed because the from a biological perspective, I have to keep in mind that I
Mhm.
do have a bit of a time clock, but that the academic um, path that that I've been on has
Mhm.
primarily been designed for men, and
Mhm.
there's not the opportunities available to me to take pauses and to take maternity leave and to do a lot of the things that
Mhm.
women have to do in order to be able to go after the things that we want and get everything we want out of life. And so and also there was a lot of times when I was in pre-med where people would be like, "Oh, are you sure you want to do that? Like
Mhm.
that's a very male dominated field," things like that. And so there was constant doubt being pushed at me from a young age of like whether or not I should do this, whether or not I could do this, and none of my male peers ever encountered that.
Mhm.
And the same thing with like people would ask me about oh, but like, what about starting a family? Like, oh, why are you choosing your career over family? And none of my male peers ever had that question. And so, from a societal perspective, it's really just the assumption that women can't have both career and family.
Mhm.
And it's not true, but a lot of those barriers are because we don't allow our system to accommodate for those needs and the differences that men and women have when it comes to enduring pregnancy, childbearing, childcare, things like that.
So you started with academic. How are there barriers in the academic field when the majority of scholarships in STEM go to women? And
Yes.
there's women for STEM, like there's entire parts of organizations that are pushing women to go into STEM, and it's really not the same for men.
Right. And so I think, again, this goes towards like you have this idea of more strict legal
Mhm.
or like actual barriers to
Mhm.
access,
Mhm.
where I'm talking in a more nuanced way of the timeline that women find themselves in, people who are already mothers, people who want to become mothers. A lot of it does come down to families and child rearing and
Mhm.
the responsibilities that you have to balance both academically and with your family. But even outside of like the family dynamic, just the discrimination that women will experience when it comes to us wanting to achieve these higher level degrees and these more rigorous academic and like professional settings.
Mhm.
A lot of people will automatically have doubt that we're capable of doing it, and that comes from like a societal.
Who are the people? Like, who was saying this to you? Was it like, how often did this happen?
It happened a lot, especially in undergrad when I was pre-med.
Mhm.
I was in a
Like, was it from your family? Was it once a
Mhm.
week? Like, I'm trying to understand the frequency of this discrimination.
Yeah, so not my immediate family. My
Mhm.
immediate family has always been my biggest cheerleaders,
Okay.
but definitely extended family, people. I was in a sorority in Texas, so definitely
Mhm.
people who I encountered in undergrad. A lot of my professors and advisors, like
Mhm.
they'd be like, "Oh, this is a really rigorous
Mhm.
path to go down. Like, are you sure that you want to?"
Mhm.
And then I would speak to a lot of my male peers who were like in pre-med, the same track as me, and
Mhm.
I'd ask like, has anyone ever told you like you couldn't do this or that you should think about
Well,
something else? And they would all say
do you
no.
think it's because women quit more? Because I mean, the data shows that women quit careers in STEM quicker than men.
Right. And that goes back to what I was talking
Mhm.
about, right? Because you have to look at the reasons that they're quitting.
Mhm.
And a lot of times it's because of things like discrimination against them,
Mhm.
which creates a hostile work environment and a hostile academic environment, or they're not able to balance like
But,
the
like, what
needs of
is
their
the
family.
discrimination? It just sounds like it's words you don't like. Like, people say words that they don't like to men all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm here, right? I'm a
Yeah.
doctor now, so it
Mhm.
didn't bother me, but I think it's pretty disingenuous to believe that those words don't have an impact because words do matter. And when undergrad is 4 years plus, my master's was 1
Mhm.
year, my doctorate was 4 years. And so that's 9 years of my life that I've had to endure people constantly bringing doubt to my ability
Mhm.
to accomplish this goal. And I did it anyways, and I'm
Mhm.
extremely proud of that.
But
But I also, let me finish.
mhm.
I also don't fault a lot of women for giving into that pressure and having those years and years of people pushing that doubt onto them. Of course, it's going to seep into a lot of them and they're going to have that self doubt because of all of the external doubt that's fed their way.
Yeah, but I think the world doesn't care. And men understand when they go into the world that the world does not care about their problems and how they feel. And the problem is women go into a man's world and think that the world should care about how they feel and their problems.
See, and I think of it as the opposite way. I don't think that it's good that men's feelings aren't cared about. I think that we should care about everyone's feelings. I think that we should realize that our words matter and the way that
Mhm.
our words impact people matter. And it shouldn't go to like, oh, well, men don't care, so we should just say whatever we want and you
Mhm.
shouldn't care. I think it's the opposite. I think that we need to be more compassionate and we need to understand the way that we impact people.
And that's totally great if we have a wish list, but this is the real world and not the way that we want the world to be. And the problem is women go into a man's world and they have no idea how harsh it is and how mean they are to each other. And if you've ever been in a male only dominated environment, like where it's pretty much all men, there's only one or two women, they're harsher than women are. They're more direct, they speak in a different way. And the problem is women go into these spaces and they think that men should talk like women talk and they don't.
Right. Well, again, I'm a dreamer, right?
Yeah.
I think when
But
I
it's not
take part.
realistic is the point.
And I disagree. I think it's completely realistic to take people's feelings into account. It's called empathy. I
Mhm.
think that we need to promote empathy. I don't think that we should promote such a callous, harsh world. I think that we all need to be more kind and compassionate to each other. And I also think that the mental health outcomes of men proves that that's not a good way to endure the world.
Right, but good is not like hope is not a strategy. The way that we want the world to be isn't how it is. So it's really nice and dandy to say the world should be this way, but it isn't. And men have an understanding of how the world is and they don't complain. So the thing is, you keep talking about.
They complain all the time.
So I'll give you an example. So you're talking about all this stuff that you endured in your career, and that's fine. I think it's really great that you're a doctor. Like it's very impressive. That's hard to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
okay.
very
Yeah.
hard to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I'll give you props. However, when I have a cousin that works on a crab fishing boat in Alaska, where a guy dies every single week, so that we can get crabs. Like literally one person dies a week on that crab fishing boat in Alaska.
Mhm.
I don't have a lot of empathy for people that say these words hurt my feelings and therefore I'm oppressed. They don't complain. They don't cry about work conditions. They just do their job. And it's a male dominated field. Women are not doing those jobs.
Yeah, so that's called the fallacy of relative pervasion. So
Mhm,
saying that somebody else has it worse off
mhm,
means that we shouldn't be able to talk about smaller problems. Like
mhm,
that's a fallacy. Both things can be problems and both deserve to be talked about.
mhm,
I don't think that it's right that one person dies a week on crab fishing boats. I don't eat crab. I don't think it's
mhm,
necessary. And I am not saying that we shouldn't fish for crab, like whatever, but we shouldn't say, oh, people die all the time in this
mhm.
career, and just because your feelings are hurt, I don't have to care. Like that's not an appropriate
Well,
way to look at
I
the
think
world.
what I'm getting at is how spoiled it makes people that complain about those things seem when there are men dying to do jobs to give us crab and put different food on the table, or even the number one workplace fatality for men in the Midwest is logging. So when you're sitting on a chair that's made of wood that a guy died to get here, it makes you look pretty spoiled when we're saying, "Oh, but people said mean words to me in my career." And
See,
it's not just you. Like I think it's just overall females' careers. We're not really dying to put food on the table. We're not dying to build the buildings. We're not dying to do any of these things. And so I don't think we really have a right to complain that we're so oppressed when men are doing most of the hard jobs in society.
yeah, I mean, you're allowed to have that opinion. It's the wrong opinion, but you're allowed to have it.
Okay.
I don't think that anybody should die at their job. I think that if we really want to talk about the way that men enter into these dangerous career paths and the way
Mhm,
that their lives are just seen as fodder, like they are just, seen as expendable. And I think that's wrong. I think that there is space for both conversations.
mhm,
There's a space to say that men don't deserve to be harmed in their workplace the
mhm.
same way that women don't deserve to be harmed in their
But
workplace.
men understand that that's the only way things get done.
I don't agree with that.
Well, you cannot agree, but how else has it ever been done?
You think that we have to,
Men have always died to protect and build civilizations.
yeah, and civilization is
Always.
supposed to progress. Civilization is supposed to improve on itself. If we stay stagnant, then we're doing it wrong. If we're looking at these careers and saying, hey, people are dying, we
Mhm,
should look at why they're dying and we
mhm.
should address it and we should fix it. We shouldn't just accept it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very female way of looking at things because you've never been in that position where you have to pragmatically solve those types of problems.
Hmm.
The same way I'm not going to know how to stop the men dying on fishing boats, you're not going to know either.
Right, that's not
So,
my
but it's
job, but
right,
there
right. But
are
it's
people
easy,
who
but it's
have
easy
jobs.
to say, oh, this shouldn't happen. The same way we could say, like, we shouldn't have anyone die in war, but we want to be safe.
Do you not think that there are people whose job is dedicated to improving worker safety? Like those jobs exist. It's not my job, it's not your job, but those jobs exist.
Hmm.
And you should argue that they need to have more responsibility. They need to be doing their job better. Like workers' unions,
Hmm.
safety commissions, like there are actual jobs and committees and boards dedicated to worker safety. And if they're not doing their jobs appropriately, then that's a totally separate conversation.
Yeah, and again, this is all stuff that sounds nice, but it's just not very pragmatic. Again, men have always died to protect and build civilization. The difference is in the past, they used to get thank you and an appreciation, and now they don't. Because feminism has convinced women that our jobs are equally as important to men's, and they're not.
Yeah, and society is the only reason society exists is because it is built on the backs of the unpaid and unrecognized labor of women.
Mhm.
Sure, men have died in war, men have died in dangerous jobs, and I would argue that if women were in charge, we would
Mhm.
have less war and we would have less death, but
It's
that's
not
a whole.
true. Women have waged more war in the last 500 years when they were rulers.
Yeah, and you also have to look at who they had as their representatives and for their counsel because this
Okay.
has been like highly studied that it
Mhm.
wasn't necessarily their individual choice. A lot of it was like pressure from
Right.
their
Whenever
committees.
women make a bad decision, women have the privilege of blaming it on someone else where men have to take the fall.
That's an interesting perspective. I disagree.
So, going back to, do you agree that men do most of the most difficult and needed jobs in society?
No.
Okay. How would society keep running without men doing the infrastructure jobs like logging, fishing, trucking,
Oh, do
Amaz-
you mean like in the world wars when men left and women took over those positions and we ran the entire country and took over the jobs that you say that we couldn't do?
No, they didn't take over the majority of the jobs.
We did.
They did. They took over factory positions.
We took over the positions that
They
men
were not
left.
they were not doing the electrical, they were not doing the plumbing, they were not building the buildings, they were not
There are
paving the
women
roads.
electricians, there are women plumbers, like there are females in all of these positions. There are
Is
female.
it the majority?
No, because
Okay, so it's
historically,
not the majority.
because you have to take into the historical perspective.
What is stopping a woman today from being a plumber and electrician?
As I said, discrimination.
Why there's
Hostile workplaces, because they are made to feel as if they don't belong in those spaces. And why would you want to exist in a space where you're constantly made to feel like you shouldn't be there by the men in those positions? So men will make women feel like they don't belong there and then complain that women aren't there. So
what's your evidence for that?
what's my evidence
Yeah,
for
what's
that?
your evidence for that?
Oh, they've studied it. They've studied like workplace discrimination.
With women in
In
electrical,
male-dominated fields, yeah.
and they've said that the women feel like they're not wanted.
Yes.
And that's why they're not doing it.
Not just not
That's
wanted, not welcome.
That's very convenient. You know, here's the thing. Men don't care if they're not welcomed. They don't expect people to just accept them into a group like women do, because again, men live in the real world. Women do not. We live in this play pretend world where we're given more credit for what we actually do than we do.
So I've seen you speak many times about the detrimental effects that all of these things have on men's mental health, and that they have a higher rate of suicide, they have all these things. And so I think that it's really interesting that you care a lot, seemingly, about men's mental health, but then at the same time you'll say, oh, men don't care if you're mean to them, men don't care if they're not welcomed. You say all of these things that have an impact on men's mental health. So I think to care about one, you have to recognize how it impacts the other.
What I'm saying is men understand that that's the real world, and they know there's nothing they can do to change that. Women go into a man's world and they expect to be given special treatment and privileges. They expect to be the new guy in a company and feel welcome. I mean, it's not abnormal for men to haze somebody in a new group. You might say that's wrong, but it's not abnormal, and they don't complain, they don't strike, they don't protest. They just accept it, and they accept the world as it is instead of doing a wish list that will never become true.
I mean, do they really accept it, and are they really okay with it when the statistics behind men's mental health proves that it does impact them? They just internalize it. Women make sure that we prioritize empathy and communication. So when we feel like we're not being welcomed, when we feel like we're being wronged, we want to improve the communication to improve the circumstance.
We're better at complaining.
I would say we're better at communication.
We're better at complaining about the stuff we don't like, where men don't complain. That's what I said.
Right. They don't complain because they internalize it. And then instead they just unalive themselves. That's not a proper coping strategy. They don't complain because the world doesn't give them sympathy.
Young women get a ton of sympathy on the internet complaining about their problems. It's why they're given 10 times the funding for breast cancer research instead of prostate cancer. It's because people care about women's issues. People do not care about men's issues.
I disagree.
Why?
Why do I disagree?
You could say you disagree, but that's not an argument.
I mean, your arguments are just like, oh, that's silly and I live in reality. Like, you're not giving me any realistic responses either.
Well, I'm giving you realistic responses. I said men do the majority of infrastructure jobs. They're the majority of workplace deaths. And so based on those two stats, they have a harder work environment and they complain less.
Yeah.
If you look at the industries that strike and complain, it tends to be female-dominated industries because women are better at complaining.
No,
they want to do less of the work and they want more of the credit.
We care about how we're treated, as men should care how they're treated. And they do care, they just internalize it. Just because they don't take action doesn't mean that they don't care.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. This was fun. You want to tell them your socials and your social media where they can find you? Go ahead.
Yeah, so you can find me primarily on TikTok. I'm Dr. Bronte, Bronte, like the Bronte sisters. And then on Instagram, I'm at Be Kind and Curious.
Cool. And you're welcome to use any of the clips, shorts, whatever for your social media. Guys, who do you think is right? Feel free, put whatever, either or, her stuff, my stuff. Like the video on your way out and subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. And I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye.